Táthas deisbh couple focail rá an mille seo. Minister, there's two parts to this bill, and it's not the first time a bill had two very, very disparate parts, and I understand why that's done. So I'm going to treat them separately, because I remember suggesting, by the way, and it'd be of interest to you, when they were talking about the Irish Language Act in the North and so on, that they bring in the Languages Act, but there'd be two parts separately, and the provision would be totally separate. One for the Irish language that would reflect the status of it in the Good Friday Agreement, and the other for Ulster Scots, reflecting a different status, because there was a different status in the Good Friday Agreement, but in the one act. So I think there is merit in doing things like that and being creative when we're legislating. You know, I'm going to welcome this, because you know, anything that rationalises and eases the burden of social welfare means testing, I support, and I hope that this is another step of more changes to the means testing regime, because I've often said that it's true that if you're down, the state will set a basic income, which is the welfare system, and in all circumstances you should be entitled to a welfare payment, and that's the system we have. But I would argue that for those just above that, the minute you start climbing the ladder, we tend to haul you back at a fairly drastic rate. And I believe that this is a whole lot of inhibiting factors in people. It inhibits them improving their standard of living. And that's not a good thing, because the minimum or the basic social welfare rate should be seen just as that, as a basic. But as many people as possible should be facilitated to have a higher income than that. And then eventually, if you get high enough, you should come clean out of the system and you start becoming a taxpayer. And it should be seamless, and it's not. And as you know, the penalty or the means testing is much more severe in reality in terms of the financial penalty it imposes on you than many of the higher end tax rates on individual citizens. So basically the changes here are twofold. You're changing the means test of the child maintenance payment, and it'll no longer be assessed as means. And I believe that that's sensible. I'd argued many a time, and I was surprised when you'd be doing cases, that that wasn't the way it was. But I do think that that's an important step in the right direction. And it stops people being pushed into poverty. And you know all the positive consequences of not being in poverty, and we all know the consequences of being in poverty, the dependency it creates, the disadvantage for children particularly, and it often leads to educational disadvantage, and it can often lead to intergenerational disadvantage. And what we should be doing is doing the opposite, is trying to make it much easier for people to be above that and to move on with their lives. The second one is the discontinuation of the liable relative provisions, whereby when a lone parent is in receipt of one parent family payment, and the Department of Social Protection has a legislative basis to carry out an assessment of the other parent and to issue a determination order for them to pay a contribution to the department or the cost. I wouldn't think you took in much money. And this is one of these old provisions that was a drag on the system. And in your 23 or 25 or 26 billion budget, we're not providing any saving. In fact, we're just causing more grief, more administration, and so on. You know, I hope that this is the first. This year, you've done once before, and you've done good work on the means testing and the carers allowance and the fuel allowance particularly, and that has been very welcome. But you know, I'm looking forward to this report that you have prepared on social welfare means testing, and I'm looking forward to a continuous rollout. I don't think it should be a big bang report or a big bang implementation. I think the best thing always is to do things step by step and to ensure that any unintended consequences get ironed out fairly rapidly. So I look forward to that happening. Now, the second thing I'd just like to talk about, very briefly, because I understand I've only 2 minutes, is I always thought that the payment that was given to Ukrainians compared to international protection candidates was out of kilter completely. It actually left them better off than Irish citizens because they were getting boarding lodgings, even with the changes that have been made, for something like €50 a week. Whereas somebody who was on social welfare would have had to pay €40 rent and then buy their own food and so on, and heat and light. I do think this change is sensible. I would have liked to see two things. There's two things about it, though, in my 1 minute, 24 seconds. The first one, I think the allowance of €38 a week for everybody that's on international protection and for what now will be the Ukrainians is low. And I think that that should be reviewed and raised because it is a very small amount of discretionary money for a person to have. But I do agree with that everybody will be on the same basis. The other one that I find that really worries me is the 90-day. I know it's not your department, but it's part of the suite of measures, and you might carry the message back. What happens after 90 days? Where are they meant to go? If we put them on the housing list, you know what's going to happen. More competition within communities who are all queuing up for public or social housing or for HAP and so on. And if they don't go there, where are they going to go? So I think that's the one part of this that really, really worries me, for the consequences within communities and for the consequences for those seeking chartament or asylum or refuge in this country who come from Ukraine. And I think we need to think this out and say, no, we can't do the 90 days. Because all the people in international protection, quite rightly, don't face the 90 days because they're not entitled to HAP and they're not entitled to go in the housing market. But even if you did make them, you're putting a pressure and more competition within communities who already feel that the housing lists are way too long. And I think that one should be thought out again. Good morning.